I hope all of you can hear me. I'm really sorry about this. What? Oh, okay, somebody says, okay. Yeah, so, I think this is the revenge which computers always take on me because I've been writing all these nasty articles about technology. And Rahul and me checked the whole thing and it worked very well. And then just before we wanted to start this, the whole thing happened. So anyway, I'm really sorry about that. And I'm glad that you're all part of this. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how this kind of an exercise really works. So I'm very grateful to Jaya, Rahul, and others for this opportunity to share some thoughts. And when I heard about this idea of the story thing, it seemed very interesting because the story of space is obviously a very important story to be told. And I've often held the view in my own work over these years that a lot of stuff which we understand through science or philosophy can be understood as particular kinds of narratives. If you want to call it story, you could call it story. But stories, unfortunately, have been so closely associated with fiction that people get really upset when you say story of science, for example, or story of the way the world began. So I'm very glad that this attempt to remove this very important human instinct of storytelling, narrativizing things around you, is brought back without these connotations of truth, untruth, etc., etc. So, so I want to use this opportunity to talk about something, very loosely, which I called philosophy of space, and that's a very vast field, as I'm sure all of you are aware. But the aim in doing this is not to really list out what philosophers have said about space, and that's of course a part of the story, but rather to really understand why philosophers want to ask such questions. What is it that they are doing when they are asking such a question, right? So in other words, I want to look at the question of space, the story of space, if you like, by trying to make sense of why philosophers do what they do. Why philosophers turn off, the last one. Why philosophers ask the questions that they do. And definitely, like, the question of space has had a great engagement both with philosophers and scientists. And the story of space evolves over centuries of by ways in which mathematicians, scientists, philosophers, writers, all artists who have engaged with this particular question. So I'm going to restrict myself to one very specific point, a very small point, but I want to start with that. And I want to motivate you why we need to talk about this as a starting point. And perhaps it will also clarify many of the questions around the idea of space. And the way we could start off with that is to just ask the question, what is space? Which is a very fundamental question, of course, because we are trying to talk about something called space. And I want to try and ask the question, how much clarity do we really have about the term space, which allows us to build upon the kind of narratives we have about what that concept or idea or entity called space is. So the first question is to start with the problem of the idea of space, or the problem of the quote unquote object called space, or if you would like, an entity called space. Now, when I ask the question, what is space, we are already, the language infects the problem here. It makes it a bigger problem than what it may be. Because when we ask a question, what is something, very often we tend to ask these questions which are, which expect responses as if things are like objects. And what I mean by objects is, when I look at a chair in front of me or an object in front of me and ask, what is this? I seem to have immediately an idea of what this is, that something is there in front of me. And I want to know what that is. And for me to know what is there in front of me is for that thing to present itself as an object. And what do I mean by an object? Something which is present before me, which seems to have some shape and color and certain other characteristics. And it allows, it's finite. It's not spread all over the universe, that I'm actually able to see the chair in front of me identify it as a chair. It's got some notion of individuality, boundaries, and so on. And then I don't understand what it is and ask, what is this? And then you might come and say, well, that's a chair. And I might learn something about the name of the object. And then I learn other things about the object. Now, when I ask this question about space and I ask, what is space? Then you could ask, okay, what is it that you're pointing to and asking what is space? Just like I can point to a tree or a chair and ask, what is this? What am I really pointing to when I'm asking what is space? And this is at the physical level. That is, what we are asking is, when you ask what is space, what is our idea of that thing called space, that entity called space, which we want to know more about? So one way of asking this question, what is space, is by pointing. It's by pointing to something and asking, what is it? And if it is space, and if somebody asks you, okay, point to me space, and I can point, but the tragedy of pointing to space is you can never point to space. Because when you point at something, when you point your finger at something, let's say the emptiness around you, and say that space I'm talking about, we would often tend to look at which object your finger is pointing towards. It could be the far off something there, if the door and part of the house here, or a chair or a table or a book somewhere. You just can't seem to point to this emptiness and say, oh, that's space, and that's the object I'm talking about, because space doesn't present itself like an object, like other objects do. So then the immediate response would be to say, well, forget about thinking about it as an object. Maybe it's an idea. Maybe when you're asking what is space, you're pointing to something in your head, and you're actually asking the question, what is space in your, what is the space? When I'm asking what is space, you're pointing to the idea of space that you have, and you're trying to ask that question about space. Maybe that is, one way of looking at it. Now, what I want to suggest to you and argue, is that this question is serious enough to merit very serious philosophical, scientific, and so, many other other kinds of artistic interventions into the question. And each one of them have actually dealt with this question in somewhat different ways. And the philosophical description, therefore, begins by asking, you're talking about something, but talk about it as what? You can talk about it as an object. You can talk about it as a concept. You can talk about it as a thought. You can talk about it as an experience. And that's a very important point about space. So when somebody asks what is space, it's not like think of it as something, somebody asking, what is joy? Of course, you may have moments of joy, and somebody says, what is joy? And you're not going to say, let me point to what joy is, and this is what joy is. And you can't point physically to it, but you can point conceptually to it. Joy actually, interestingly, appears as a kind of a individuated object. That is, what joy is. You can differentiate joy from, let's say, sadness. And you can say, this is the time I begin to feel joyful, and this is the time it ends. And this is the contours of it. Has certain properties. When you are joyful, you feel light, you may feel whatever, you may feel all's good in the world, you may feel a sense of hope and so on. So joy has qualities which you can hold on to. And so even though I can't point to what is joy, I can mentally point to it as if it is like an object. So it's differentiated, it's individuated in that particular way. Space does not allow that also. So if I have to do that, then I have to ask, what is it like? Joy causes certain kinds of experiences, perhaps, which I can identify. What kind of experiences does space capture? What kind of experiences do I have of space? So and this is a very important point about space, because it gives alternate ways of understanding space away from one particular kind of philosophical thinking about it. And it's something very important, even of course to philosophy, but also to many art forms, and including in dance and in any movement art. The space is experienced in very important ways, and it's something which I can come back to at the end. But this is just to show you that to ask the question, what is space, is to either say, well, it's like an object I can point out and show you what it is, or it is something like a conceptual thought-like thing, and I can describe to you what its qualities are. Or I can tell you, well, I have an experience of it. When I am in space, I feel these kinds of things, and I can tell you something about it, and so on. Now, all these kinds of questions are doing what job? They're trying to tell you whether there is something called space or not. In other words, they're trying to articulate what you might want to call as a reality of space in some sense. That, well, space is real or not real. And if you want to say it's real, you want to say in what sense it is real. In other words, we are going back to this question of the idea of story. Well, is space just a story which humans have created? And then you'll have to ask for what? Why do they want to create such a story? Why do you want to create the characters you create in your stories? Is space such a character? And if you have created for what? What work does it really do? Okay, so let me tackle this problem head on in the way philosophers have done. And as I said, I want to try and motivate you why for philosophers these questions are important and interesting. And I'm sure you'll find that much of these questions about space are part of your own engagement with the question of space. So let's try and see why we should not take space seriously. I'll start with that. In other words, why the idea of why space could actually be the biggest fiction that we have been told. It's the biggest story in that sense of fiction. It's something which doesn't exist, but everybody's been talking about it, and we're all bought into this thing about space. And we are bought so much into it that the government of India, like every other government, spends on billions and on whatever amount of money on running programs called space programs. Of course, what ISRO means by space is very different from what we are talking about as space. But it's also very interesting. They also have something called space program. They will use the term space for it. They will talk about space as if it is something real because they want to explore space, just like you explore a new world or a new city. They want to do certain things, utilizing the properties of space and so on. So there is this kind of thing. So let's start with this possible counter and say why maybe there is nothing called space, and why would that be? There are very good reasons for it. One, and this is something which has always been part of the philosophical puzzle about space. One is that space cannot be seemingly something physical, because everything in the world which is physical, objects in the world which are physical, appear to us through the senses which we have. Let's say the 5 senses. I know that this computer is in front of me because I can touch it, feel it, smell it, taste it, whatever. From these 5 senses, to start off with, I have access to the world. I have access to the things in the world. Now, what about space? What is interesting about space is that you can't touch space, because I don't know, I'm touching something when I keep doing this, and I don't know if you can see my hand, but there's a lot of empty space between me and the screen of the computer. I'm trying to grab it, and I don't think any of us would call that as, oh, I'm touching space, or I'm caressing space when I do this. I'm not really caressing space. I don't know what I'm doing when I'm doing this. Maybe, but you need different imaginations also to say that you're actually doing that, perhaps, okay? I'm talking at the very minimal point of what we mean by senses. The second point is about smell. You don't smell space. You can smell things through space. Space functions as a medium through which you can smell, but you don't smell space. There's no smell of space by itself. Just like there's no taste of space. I can't keep licking the empty space around me and saying, oh, taste here is bitter and taste there is sweet and so on. It doesn't seem to have smell, taste, sight, touch, nothing. None of the 5 senses seem to allow me a grasp of that thing called space. And why would I don't ask these same 5 questions for ideas and concepts. I don't say, well, I have a concept in my head, or I have a thought or an idea in my mind. Of course, I can't touch it, etc., in the way I would touch a physical object. But of course, you have an experience of your idea. In fact, I would say that your idea, for one way in which your idea appears to you, is through sound. You do hear your idea, because that's what thinking, for example, one of the very important modes of thinking is that. So I have an idea. Of course, you have an idea because you've experienced it, because you have heard it. You may have heard it in your inner ear, but you have heard it. Or you have seen a picture in your head, a visual imagination, and you have seen it. Space does not allow you even that. It seems to be completely outside any kind of access to the human body and the human, system of cognition. But yet, this is ironic. we are surrounded by it. It is obvious to us. It is so obvious that we think it is there. We are immersed in it, and yet we are completely out of touch with it. And that's why you have to create stories about it. Otherwise, you have no way of making sense of the fact that there is something which seems so obviously surrounding and around you, and yet you do not have the conceptual, cognitive, linguistic, maybe even imaginative possibilities to grasp it. So that should be a good reason to do philosophy of space. That should be a good reason to ask certain philosophical questions about this mysterious thing, which is completely immersed, in which we are completely immersed, but which resists our grasp of it in very important ways. But all that I have said doesn't show that it is there. All I have said that unlike everything else which I have talked about, including, let us say, mathematical ideas like 2 + 2 = 4 and so on, I could still say, well, 2 + 2 = 4 still is sense. I have a sensory idea about it because I'm thinking about it, hearing it, I'm manipulating it, and so many things happen. So there is still that, there seems to be a kind of an access, and I'm searching for that kind of an access to this thing called space in order to make an argument that, look, there is something really called space. Now, can space then have other properties, if not the sensation properties? Because there are two very interesting possible ways of actually answering this question. One, let's look at some other qualities of space. It seems to have certain properties. If it may not have color, shape, size, etc., but it seems to have some other properties. And one property is actually very fascinating because it's related to the idea of an object. It's related to our ideas of what we see as objects. So let me put it this way. On the one hand, it seems to be that the human physical cognitive system is far more comfortable with objects. We see objects, we identify objects, we do things with objects all the time. Okay? But objects cannot be objects if you do not have a conception of space. Okay, think about this. It's a, remember the question I'm asking, the philosophical question is slightly in the background still, which is whether there's something called space, and if there is really something called space, what kind of a thing it is, what kind of existence does it have. So after telling you we can't access it in any of the ways in which we access everything else, I'm shifting this mode of argument slightly and saying our basic cognitive capacities seem to be focused on the question of objects. We look at the world through objects. And space comes to us as an intrinsic definition of objects. So, suppose I tell you, just for you to, as a thought experiment for you to think about, suppose I tell you that, objects, the definition of an object that you have needs a definition of space. Now that way, it looks like a kind of a backhanded way of giving privilege to the question of space and trying to recapture the question of space. But think about this possibility that you cannot define an object, that which we seem far more comfortable with, that I can point to and say, oh, that's a chair, it's got these properties, etc. And I feel far more, comfortable in talking about objects, in thinking that I have access to objects. But starting with that, if I tell you that you cannot have a conception of an object without conception of space, then every time you talk about an object and you're comfortable with an object and you think that gives you solidity, you're actually dealing with the idea of space. You are sensing space through sensing objects. That can be one kind of an idea to think about. And how is that possible? So let me again give you very intuitive pictures of it, right? One is to say that an object is defined as an object, becomes an object for you when you are able to identify it as an object. We'll begin with that. There are different kinds of objects, but we'll begin with this particular object. So the chair appears to me as a chair because it has very clear boundaries. And because it has very clear boundaries, I'm able to distinguish the chair in front of me from a table and from the sofa and some phone and so on. So there is an identity condition which differentiates objects. But those identity conditions need a notion of space for you to be able to distinguish one object from another. So imagine if the chair in front of me is so large and so extended, and it's not localized in front of me inside the room that I'm sitting, but let's say it's like 1 mile long. And it's a huge couch, which is 1 mile long. And then I'm looking at that couch, and I can see parts of that couch, but I do not recognize it as an object until I recognize the dimensions of that object, the limits of that object, the boundaries of that object. I may recognize its materiality, right? And that's still very different from space. But in the way in which we understand these objects, the fact that one object is different from the other is distinguished by this thing called space between them. So one way is to say that the idea, the notion of space is experienced through our notions of differences in objects, that there is something in between them that makes them objects. If the thing between them is dissolved and they become just, think about us as human bodies, right? So there are many different bodies. I'm sitting here, Rahul is sitting here, there are other people around, and all of you are sitting there. But imagine if all these bodies fuse into one for some odd reason, that all our skins and hands extend, all bodies blow up, and we all get stuck to each other, and we are one big, huge, it's a terrible thing to imagine, but imagine that. And you're all stuck like that, and you don't, there's no space between bodies to even distinguish one body from the other. You might have a name for it, but you'll only have a name for it if that is distinguished from something else. If that is in space, which is distinguished from something else much bigger. By itself, a big wall, an infinite piece of matter in front of you can never be understood and cognized. So, space makes objects possible. Now, this is actually a very counter view to another very important view from Leibniz and others, which are called the relational theories. And the idea is very simple, and I think it's very interesting. It's the exact reverse of what I'm trying to tell you. So I'm only placing different possibilities, because the question, this is not, obviously it's not about answers to who said what, but I want to see why people think the way they do. And so, the counter position which has been held is the argument that it is not, unlike what I have told you till now, it's not that you need space to define objects, but it's actually that you only have objects in the world. And space is just some, a relation. It's a way of talking. It's a way of talking about what? We mistake that the mistake we do is that we think we're really talking about something called space. But when I talk about space and invoke space, it's a way of talking about objects. It's a way of saying this object is not the same as that object. And this object is 2 meters from that object. This object is up or down or left of that object, and so on. All these are not referring to talking about the emptiness between the objects, but it's actually talking only about objects and something called a relation between them. And relations are not real. This is something which is a very important idea, and it's part of a larger philosophical problem about relations. And there's a very simple, of course, a wonderful simple example is this about the reality of relations. And let us say there is, let's say there are 2 people. Let's say there's a father and a daughter, and there is a father and there's a person A and there's a girl B. There's a man A and a girl B, and they're related by the relationship of fatherhood or daughterhood. But what is really real? The only things which are present in the world are just these 2 objects, the man and the girl. There is not yet another entity in the world called father other than these 2 people, or a daughter other than these 2 people. Father and daughter are not independent entities which exist. They are ways of talking about these two objects. Just like you're saying this person is brown in color and has black hair and is 6 feet tall, is also another property which is, some way of relational property with respect to other objects. And therefore, this relational argument, the Leibnizian argument, which goes as follows, would be to say that what is there in the world are just objects. And it's like the genealogy, and space is like the genealogical tree. The genealogical tree has a father, mother. I mean, you can start with those two people and then put the whole children and the children's children and so on. But what is really there in the world are just these people, father, mother, children, etc. Not the tree. There's no other extra tree other than these people. And the tree is just a way of representing something and not a real thing in itself. And space is like this tree of objects, if you like. It just maps a particular description of objects. That's the counter to what I told you, because I began by saying objects are only defined by space. We didn't have space, you can't define objects. And that's always, this puzzle has been at this, or this conflict has been at the center of most of the theories of space. And it goes back, I mean, even if you come down to very important theories of science about space, you'll see this kind of a thing happening, because there's yet another issue. I mean, I think a lot of philosophy and a lot of science actually can be reduced to just an analysis of two things. One is matter, object, thing which is there in front of you, unlike space, which is not material. So the nature of objects and matter. And two, the nature of motion. And these two have been the most important puzzling features which has catalyzed much of great thoughts in philosophy as well as in science. And definitely in arts, like in movement arts and so on, very important deep insights into the idea of motion itself. And we don't need to do, very high level, whatever disciplines, but just go back to this very simple question and ask, what is it that space is? What really would you say space really is? And the first thing which you see, which you have to accept, is that even if you have objects and so on, right, then there is something which objects do, for which the idea of space seems to be essential. Just like space seems to be essential to define objects, and that's why some philosophers would call space as a container for objects, to something in which objects can be retained and present. But space does something very important for objects. Space is what allows objects to move. Now, when I say something like this, it seems to be a very colloquial way of talking about it, an ordinary way of talking about some process. If there is no empty space, obviously objects can't move. Imagine again a world in which all these objects are stuck to each other, and then where are objects going to move? How do you move when you are completely packed? So obviously motion seems to demand something of space, but when I say it like this, when I say that you need space for things to move, it can be misunderstood, which very often people tend to sometimes misunderstand, which is that space causes things to move. Because just to say that space is a condition for things to move, that is, if there are no space, you cannot move, is one way of looking at it. Or the other thing is to say space is somehow causing an object to move. And if space can cause things, then it is real. It has some existence. It has some presence in the world. It can affect the world. It can affect it in so many important ways. Then you're not really bothered whether you touch it, feel it, etc., because it's affecting you in a very deep sense. So this question of motion, it's a very simple point, and it's such a simple point, and it's so wonderfully, I think it's one of these great aesthetic beauties of thought that you see when people analyze motion. Because the first great philosophical ideas, both with Greek and Indian thought, most famously Zeno and Nagarjuna, or if you look at the first great physics, which appears from either Newton or Einstein as two paradigmatic pillars, are all about motion. Newton's Principia Mathematica, which is where his famous 3 laws of motion are there. The Newton's gravity law is the founding text, I would say, of classical physics. begins by Newton saying, the task which I've set out to show is to understand how to distinguish apparent motion from true motion. Because motion is very deceiving. Swing, but you seem to be at rest. And when you are at rest, you can seem to be in motion. And the task of physics for Newton was to say, well, how do we actually figure this damn thing out? That when am I actually really moving as against just sitting around? The best example is the Earth. Of course, you're all moving pretty fast right now. All of us are just actually zooming through space, but we are really sitting like couch potatoes and thinking that we are couch potatoes and having consequences of that, but we are actually moving really, really fast through space. So what is really the problem about motion? One, the point is that it seems to be that you need, need motion, you need space, something called space to make motion possible. One, it can make it possible as a causal force, a power, which would say, okay, now you can, it makes objects move, which might sound a bit odd to us today, but not odd to many other thinkers earlier. Or two, it is an enabling condition. Because it stays out of your way, the object moves. So these are both positive and negative conditions. Causality can be seen as a positive condition. It's something really pushes something to make it move. The other is to say, well, I'm not going to obstruct something to move. So that idea that space move, that objects move, immediately makes us ask the question, how do I characterize that motion? So one point, simple point. I mean, you don't have to go very deep in there. I mean, just thinking deeply will get you to all the problems about space which philosophers have talked about. So let's start with a very simple question, right? So an object is moving. So from here to here, okay. So I have this object, phone. It's moving from here to here. That's moving. Now, when I'm saying it's moving from here to here, look at what I have done. I have said it was here first and it has gone there. That is, when you're trying to answer the question, okay, when object is moving, it moves from where to where. In trying to characterize that it's moving from here to there, you're already marking out space. Because the here and there are only spaces. The here and there are not the objects. So suppose the phone is here at this moment and it has to go. They see what I see here, no? Okay, so I think you see the phone. So you go from here and it wants to come here, let's say, this spot. Now, when it is, and I'm anticipating it to move to this spot, if I don't keep my finger there, I should still be able to visualize it, say, oh, it's going there. But what is that there? That's the empty space I'm pointing to. So I'm giving you an example of how you can point that space and say, oh, this empty space here, come there. So space, without the idea of space in this sense, can you really define or even construct or conceptualize, describe, movement of objects at all? Can you even do that? Or is it that the very act of trying to say something is moving, and moving means what? Moving from here to there, and therefore that element is something called space, can lead to different ways of looking at space. One, and this is the end point of a long philosophical scientific inquiry into space, which is a Newtonian model of space, which is to say that space is a background, an inert background. Space is not moving this object from here to here, but space is the background on which this object moves, which means movement or motion is characterized by properties of space, which is what? When I ask you to describe motion, what do you say? You'll say, I went from this point to that point, or I went from Bangalore to Mysore or whatever. So I'm moving from this point to this point. And those points have to characterize motion. You need other things also to characterize motion, and that's the beauty about the philosophy of motion. I think that's why it's such a fascinating concept to think about, just simple idea of motion. But the first point is it has to move from here to here. But what are this here and here? What are these 2 points? What are they? I can say it starts from here and goes here, but you have to characterize these points without my finger. Now I'm trying to desperately, put these 2 fingers and hold it as if I'm holding a point, clipping a point and telling you, oh, here is a point, I've caught a point. No, actually I'm trying to catch a point, but that's the point, which is to say that somehow this location, this focus, this pointing to that points over here is what really defines one of the first tenets of motion, that it has moved from here to here. And that's why motion of an object which is very large, where you can't distinguish it, you can't, for example, see waves, etc. If you can't distinguish, from a huge sea wave, it's very difficult for you to really define what you mean by a very specific motion. Wave troughs you can make out. You can say exactly where that's going, but that's like an object like this point. Now look at an assumption we make in this. I mean, we are already immersed so deeply in these stories that we have to recognize that we first have to know what we know before we can even think about it. And the first point we have done now is that we have already bought into the story of space as being defined through points and locations. And this is a consequence of this great revolution by Descartes and the Descartesian idea of taking space, which is a kind of a quality, this kind of emptiness, and giving values to it. So now I can give values, X, Y, Z coordinates. I can say I am sitting in, and now thanks to GPS, and GPS is the really digital Descartesian modernization of the world. Earlier at least Descartesian Cartesian coordinates was just as X, Y, Z coordinates. Every point in space is now marked by a value. It's a name. Just like each one of us were given names, whatever the names are, so too did space get named by Descartesian Cartesian system, whereby every point in space will have the name of X, Y, Z. So you can actually identify one point from another and say, oh, this point, this person is X1, Y1, Z1, and this point is X2, Y2, Z2. And those are 2 names. There's really no big difference other than the 2. And that's a very important way of identifying and almost making space as if they are real objects, points, as if points are real things. And there's nothing more absurd than a naive understanding of points as real. And mathematicians know this very well. They don't, they talk about points as if they're all real, but when you ask them, hey, where is a point? And you can't even draw a point and say, oh, this is a point. Let me make a point with a pen and show you. That's a point, because that's not a point. That's actually a disk. It's a 2-dimensional and actually 3-dimensional disk. It's like a frisbee. It may have very little thickness and thinness and so on, but that's what it really is. Okay, so this way of naming space through all its parts really does something which goes against this other tradition of space, which was about things like this homogeneity of space, and which was the first great challenge about space. Just like I told you that space allows things to move and so on, and it doesn't resist objects of moving, there are 2 other interesting points, 3 other. One, space doesn't seem to have a boundary at all. And whether space has a boundary or not was a matter of great debate, and I think one of the distinguishing divisions between early Indian thought and early Greek thought, for example. Because for early Greek thought, the idea of space as finite was very important, and whereas the early Vedic thought, for example, begins with the understanding that space is infinite, whatever that means. I mean, we have to unpack what the exact means of space, finite, infinite, etc. are. But the idea is that space by itself, empty space by itself, was again a very big problem for the Aristotelian system of understanding the world. An empty space is what? One, this is something which we take for granted because now we say space is infinite. And everybody tells you infinity is something you can never reach. And what does it actually mean? It just means that wherever you go, you will find space. And that space has no end. You can't fall off the end of space. Then what kind of an object is that? What kind of a thing is that? And two, it also seems to be something very interesting in this homogeneity of space or isotropy or homogeneity of space is that space has no parts. My hand looks different from my head and looks different from my leg and so on. But space, every bloody part of space is the same. I mean, there can be nothing more boring than space. Because I pick a small bit of space here, it looks like the same bit of space here. And you go to Africa and pick out some small space in your hand, it looks the same thing. Everywhere you go in the universe, space is the same. Small part is the same, big part is the same. There is nothing which really differentiates any part of space. And and even if you're a person who has a psychotic hatred of space, you can't even destroy it. You put a nuclear bomb, it will only destroy the world around there. But space, nothing happens to the space of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And that's why there are good reasons for some to say that this is the biggest myth you're living under. It's just a way of a word which is there. It's like a ghost. You can talk about it, say it is there, and do everything you want as if it is there. But actually, when you wake up in the morning, it's really not there. And that, while it may seem as one possible way to answer this, I think it also goes against our most basic experiential phenomenological understanding of space. And there have been attempts to try and show why there is actually something called space and it has certain properties and so on. And one of the most interesting ways to do it, we have some more time, right? Okay. So all of you'll have to send some ping or something to stop me, otherwise you keep on going. Okay, let me then give you some positive answers to this whole thing, so you don't get too depressed about space not being there, etc. And I think there is something. There are some very interesting conceptual ideas which it throws out, and maybe some of them are worth thinking through. So I'll just try and focus on a few points, and then these are all long-term discussions, so we'll see where it goes. Let me just give you some reasons now. After giving many of the reasons for why we talk about space, and maybe it's really not there, you don't want to make what philosophers would call as ontological commitment to its existence or reality of some kind of an objecthood. But let me now try and give you reasons why we need to think of this seriously, that something called space is real. I'm putting it in quote unquote. And there are things which are very puzzling about it. At the worst, at the least, let's say at least accept that there are things puzzling about it. It doesn't seem to be an easy answer or a yes or no. And let me just give you a series of basic outline of it. If there are questions, we can talk about it. But I know they're asking questions here, but I think it's difficult to read that at this. Okay, I'll come back to those questions down the line. So let me just very briefly give you those points which should make us relook at the question of space very carefully. One, much of this qualities of space, like I told you, like parts, I can't differentiate parts of space. Everything seems to be the same. It seems to be indestructible, doesn't seem to have a boundary. All of it, I would think, well, almost all of it, or at least quite a lot of it, has great overlaps with another concept, which we know very well, but which we may not be as comfortable as accepting space, and that is the concept of nothing. You can have a department of space, you'll get 500 crores, but you can't have department of nothing. Well, you may have department of nothing, but you'll only get nothing crores or no money, And doing philosophy, we are aware of this all the time, right? So it's very close to my heart. It affects us very deeply. But one thing we can do is at least we can make a career out of talking about nothing. which I think a lot of space scientists also do, but at least we outwardly agree that we're speaking about nothing. But nothing is a very interesting idea, because all of these things we've been talking about, it seems to be about properties of nothing. And if we are talking about the properties of nothing, you can't touch it, you can't smell it, you can't feel it, you can't break it. Nothing everywhere seems to be the same. When things are, nothing is in front of you here is the same as nothing in front of you in Delhi or in wherever you go to Mars, it's the same thing. And it doesn't seem to have parts. You can't say, oh, this part of nothing I don't like, but that part of nothing I like. You can't differentiate what parts of nothing are there. It's indestructible, because whatever you try to do, you can't get rid of nothing. And when nothing defines a very fundamental human condition. For those who really want to understand the phenomenology of space and ask why should we even take the question of space seriously, go back to this phenomenology of nothingness. Two great traditions. Okay, we won't talk about it now, but definitely something which you should engage with when you talk about space. The Shunyata doctrine of Buddhists, and the ways in which you interpret the notion of nothingness, and why does nothingness become so central core of Buddhist thought? Definitely the Madhyamika thought and so on. But there are we should be very careful when I use nothing. He's not talking about nothing like space, but at least for Nagarjuna, it's pretty clear what you're talking about. But the question of nothingness is extremely important. And nothingness is a positive term, in the sense, if you want to make an ontological commitment to nothingness. As much as you see that in some of these Buddhist traditions, you'll also see that in the phenomenological existentialist traditions. So nothingness is an extremely important part of human phenomenology. Some extremely core part of human existence, and the way we make sense of the world, the way we live our lives. And that's real as much as the reality of positive objects. So one way to understand this ontological commitment to space is to go back to this ontological commitment to nothingness, either of the Buddhist or the existentialist variety, and see something very important about how to recover what is meant by real, etc., through even these concepts which seem to be not accessible to you, which seems to be, have no properties which you can use it to describe it, and so on. And as I said, it's one of the, I think one of the greatest contributions to the idea of nothingness, the idea of negation and not, really comes from Indian philosophy. All Indian philosophical traditions are deeply concerned with making sense of this nothingness and not. Among other things, of course, it's also very deeply theological. And there's a second point about space. That much of what I talk about space also seems as if many times it's like talking about God. And historically, space has always been associated with God, whether in the philosophical traditions or in the scientific traditions. Because there is something about the very nature of talking about space that makes it God-like. For example, this infinite extension. The very idea of omnipresence seems to be correlated to this infinite homogeneous extension of space, this kind of present everywhere, And this really puzzling thing about space is this: it's only space which is present everywhere. If you don't think there is a God, the real problem about space is the damn thing is present everywhere. You can't ever go to a place where space is not there. You can go to a place where there's no object. You can even imagine, this is one of the version of Kantian arguments about space. You can even imagine, maybe there's no object. I can imagine a world without object. I can imagine this room as a remote object, but I can't imagine this world without space. So wherever I go, it is present, it's there. But I don't know what is there. I don't know what is present, right? So this relationship with God and space is also to do with this idea of quality. For example, if you want to have in the Indian Vedantic tradition, a Brahman with no qualities or a God without qualities, then it seems to mimic everything you have about space. It's infinite, it's omnipresent, doesn't have shape. There's no one part of God here is different from part of God there. God may be represented in hands and legs and whatever else you want to do it, but that's really not, God is not broken up in parts. And talking about space, sometimes it's like talking about God. And many times it's actually talking about God. One of the classic instances of this happens again with the first, I would think, one of the great grand theory of space in science by Newton. Newton, you must have heard enough about Newton and his, commitment to theology and religion. But more than that, this question of space was a great influence in this. One of his teachers is influenced by Henry Moore and Isaac Barrow, his teacher, who held the view that, space, the omnipresence of space is actually represented. Omnipresence of God is not only captured by the omnipresence of space, but it's actually manifested as geometry. And the, what do they call it? Eternality, like omnipresence and eternality of God over time, right? Like omnipresence of space, eternal over time of God for Barrow is represented through arithmetic. And therefore, mathematics itself becomes very deeply theologically correlated. And that's another great story, which we can have another time. But space is directly correlated to these kinds of difficulties of talking about the qualities, objecthood, the nature of space, and nature of God. So that, that thing goes to such an extent that Newton, after he postulates his idea of absolute space, calls absolute space, in his words, he calls it sensorium of Godhead. And somehow for him, the absolute space idea was a very central core for him to make sense of his physics, and also I think his theology. And, very ironically, classical physics or Newtonian physics progressed when people are able to overthrow the idea of absolute space. So that's another story again. So, there is one, as I said, the relationship to God. And so as I said, we're trying to make sense of the positive senses. One was about nothingness, one was about its notions of theology, and the third possibility of the positiveness of space comes from an argument which you find, for example, in Indian philosophical tradition of Nyaya, for example. And that's an argument which is also worthwhile thinking about very seriously, because the argument is based on a very simple thing, that the question of what is there or what is real are not always only about perceptual, but they're also about inferential. That there are things which you can infer, that things infer that the existence of some things can be inferred and not perceived. But that has to be, as I said, fine-tuned to know what we actually mean by inference and perception, the relationship between inference and perception. But the argument, for example, from the Nayayikas and others, that you can actually infer the existence of space, means that the reality of space appears to you not because you can touch it or feel it or touch it, etc., perceive it in any of the five senses, but that they are proper objects of inference, that they make sense of various phenomena, including, for example, so for the Nayayikas, why would I want to infer space? And among other things which they talk about is that the very experience of motion, the very possibility of motion, the experience of distance, this is a very phenomenological idea that we can experience distance, that something is there. And the experience of far and near. How do you make sense of all of that? All of these experiences, which are perceptual in some, experiential in some sense, are grounds for inferring the idea of space or the presence of space or whatever else you want to do. So we have to find ways of talking about it properly, but you infer the the reality of space, because they're all grounded on these experiences. And if you cannot make sense of the fact that there's something is far off, something is close, something can move, etc., if you did not have thing, and therefore the Nayayikas go to the extent of saying space is the cause for any entity. And that therefore what we are trying to, as I said, what I'm trying to positively do here is to see how to recover various ideas of space is from theology, is from a very deep philosophical idea of shunya vada, if you like, or emptiness, and also, as I said, in the context of how you see it as an inferential term. And the fourth one is the importance of space arises through its relationship to what all of you accept as obviously real. And that would be the acceptance of what is obviously real would be objects. Unless you're terribly skeptical about the world and very depressed, you accept things that are there around you. And as I first told you that you can't understand the individuality of things without objects, without space, but now I'll give you another argument. Forget about individuality of objects, that is distinguishing one object from another. You cannot even understand what an object is as a unified thing without space. Because two very important things. If you ask what is the definition of a thing, okay, this is very central to Descartes, of course, but you will see this across philosophy much earlier in Indian philosophical traditions and so on. Very simple definition of a thing. A thing, anything in the world which you think is real and which is in front of you, anything in the world is extended, has dimensions of length, breadth, and height, for example. You don't have to call it length, breadth, height, that's very Descartian, but you can just say anything in the world is extended. It has what? It has spatial dimensions which define it. How big it is, how tall it is, how short it is, how bulky it is. All of those are spatial dimensions. And the very fundamental definition of object, the most fundamental definition of object, as I said, from Descartes to Kantian tradition, would be that a body is extended, means that it occupies certain kind of spatial dimension. Really brings the question of space and matter, things which you think are real, very closely together. And secondly, to add to the complexity of this, if you take the story from science, that objects which you see are made up of smaller objects like atoms or molecules or whatever, then if that picture is true, and at least for those of us, at least for the 10 or 1 hour in which we are using the computer, which is a byproduct of science and technology as they tell us, so if you accept that story a little bit now, then there is a lot more space than matter inside objects. So you can take a big object like a, or take a very even a small object, like my fist, and say this is an object and it has matter of some 50 grams or whatever. And if you really look at the atomic story of the world, and you look at how many atoms there are and how it's composed and they become like these atoms, molecules, and so on, then there is much more of emptiness between each of those molecules and atoms inside this object than there is matter. This thing, or well, let me use the most abused object which I use is this thing called mobile. This thing is more empty than it is mattered, if you want to use a word, or it's filled with matter. And that's really remarkable. That without this notion of emptiness or space or whatever else you want to call it, you just don't seem to be able to even grasp the simple thing like an apple and orange and so on. Whatever objects you think are very simple and which don't have philosophical problems, you can see that they have very deep philosophical problems, especially in the context of space and object. So, if you think objects are true and real, then it seems to suggest that maybe space is as true and real, because without space as a foundation, these objects can't even exist. That's one way of talking about it. But the good thing about philosophy is there are always opposite ways of talking about it. And it depends on which way you feel happy about. But I wanted to give you both sides. One after we said demolish much of what space is, I wanted to look at some things why you have to take the question of space very seriously. And finally then, I think we're almost done. Finally, we can tie down the story all the way to two things, and I just finish with that. And it's ideal, and that's where it all comes down together. As I said, there are so many interesting issues in this, and I'm just touching upon very small parts, but it's just to motivate a particular way of thinking about it, as I said. But the story has to end with the greatest popularization of space. Space has become, hip and cool and everything which all of us know about and talk about post Einstein. And there is something which Einstein does to space, which makes it something, two things. And one, it makes it, as I said, hip, but two, it also makes it real. Unlike Newton's notion of absolute, theological absolute space, which later experiments, the famous Michelson model experiment also, and Marx's critique and so on, that had already been shunted aside. Here comes Einstein and rediscovers the reality of space in a very interesting way. And the consequence of his general theory of relativity, and also his earlier special theory, is two things. One, that it's wrong to actually talk about space as an independent term. You should actually talk about space-time as the entity which we should be talking about. Space is just one break off, a part. We are very careful when I use the word part, but a part of this larger thing called space-time. And the real thing in the world, the real entity, is actually space-time. And the space-time is real in the sense it has properties which you can measure. The moment you do that, and that's as you said, the first problem was always that you didn't have space as something which you could measure. You didn't know the size, touch, smell, etc. General theory of relativity makes that a non-problem by saying, you can actually measure the curvature of space-time. And curvature of space-time is measured because it has physical consequences. And what we call as gravitation, or loosely the gravity force, is nothing but a measure of the curvature of space-time. And therefore, you are actually seeing a physical effect of space-time, which is manifested, which is very deeply therefore related to the question of motion, etc. So it goes back to a very, very powerful idea that space is intrinsically related to questions of motion and causality of space and so on. There are two traditions, of course, which are 2 points here. One tradition which is very close to this, which many of you would have heard about, perhaps not very sympathetically, is that of Vastu. And a lot of Vastu language is actually about the causal power of space. If it is, you can either call it space or direction or whatever, and that itself is a very interesting distinction between the ontology of direction and ontology of space. That is, space as an entity or direction as an entity. But, if you, as a theoretical thing, if you want to understand what it is actually saying, it's talking about the causal powers present in space and time. And also time, which is about good time, bad time, and so on, are also very closely related to that. So these are very important ways of understanding your notions of space and time, that actually space and time do have causal implications which you can actually see. And finally, of course, the very, very difficult question, which I haven't dealt with, but I won't deal with it now, which is this, post Einstein, the dependency of the notions of space and time. So much of what I began with and went through, what is space and how do you experience it, etc., can all be duplicated in the question of time. And that's a very fascinating discussion on what is philosophy of time. But, this bringing together of space and time, the suggestion that it is impossible at the ultimate reality, not at the world reality of this particular present world for various reasons, why space-time decouples and so on, but at the larger ultimate reality that space and time are very similar in some sense, is something which has really deeply captured the scientific imagination. And that's a story which really needs to be unpacked and understood in very many different ways. Okay, so this is, I've taken about an hour, so I hope it's not too long. But thank you, Pesh. I don't know what you heard, how you heard, whether you saw this thing or you hear it. technology. What do I do? They have got me into what I've been resisting, but it was great to be part of this. So, any questions? Let's see how we go.
That was great, Sundar. And just so many questions. There's a lot of questions that have already come in the chat.
Okay.
We can look at those. And then maybe people could also start asking.
Oh, I can hear somebody speaking.
Yeah, I was going to say the people who've posted the questions can maybe ask the questions now.
Oh, okay. I can read those questions also. That is.
Yeah.
Okay, should I just go through that quickly then?
This is to create a container with that making context to something.
Yeah. Okay, maybe they can ask me then or whatever.
I think it was Jaya that asked about the container.
Oh, yeah. So should I go through these questions?
Please.
Okay, so let me just go through these questions. Ready for things, please chip in and stuff. Okay, did we say first was a container? How do we go through this? 1 second.
No, the first one was by me, but ignore that because that was in response to your question of why would there need to be space in the first place, but I guess you answered that by now. So
okay, sure.
Yeah.
Don't we say we are moving through space? Yeah. So the very act that the point that we've been talking about, the ways in which we make sense of space today has come to us through these years of tortured thinking about space. And as I said, the scientific imagination of space has been deeply influential. The post-Newton, the belief that space is a background and an inert background, and that's what Einstein really challenges in a very fundamental way, that space is an inert background on which objects move, seems to give you a very good ways in which we think of space actually. Because, it's like painting metaphor, if you like. You have a canvas, and space is a canvas, and you put objects, and objects move or do various things, and that's what it really is. And the canvas doesn't interfere with objects and so on. So in fact, in this history of space, one of the most important moment occurs, at least for the European tradition, which is related to the question of modern science, is that when Italian philosophers, two very famous ones whose names I won't even try to pronounce now, remove this relationship of space and motion, as if space has something to do with motion, by shifting it to the idea of force, which is a story we buy today. We think things move because there is force acting on it, and objects move because force is pushing objects to move. But that had to happen at 16th century with these philosophers who shifted this question about space and its relationship to motion to force, and that force is a causal thing of motion. But by doing so, it's not that we have understood what force is. That itself is another very interesting philosophical story. Okay, so that's the reason why we say we are moving through space, because we need a picture of space which allows you to say that. That's really the point. By the relational theories, we're talking about space being defined on the ultimately talking about its space itself. Yeah, I think this also, I think I tried to, we came back to this. Now the relational theories are actually critiquing this need to have something called space over and beyond objects. Yeah, over and beyond objects. That so it's a world of what we are then basically saying is that, well, all that there is in this world are objects, and you can say objects are related. You need space to define it, etc. They'll even grant it. So let me speak on behalf of object people, let's say, and I say, well, only things is there in the world are objects, and you describe objects. You need language to describe objects. Doesn't make language real, no. Just because I'm talking language to talk about objects does not make language as real as objects. Languages don't have any reality as language. They have reality as sounds, perhaps, but not as language. So you could make that similar argument about space and say, well, we're only talking about a world filled with objects, and space is just one way of talking about how one object is in relation to another object. So which raises a very interesting question. If there's only one object in the world, then would you ever have the idea of space? Because there's no other object to relate it to. But the container picture will say, well, you need the object to be present somewhere. Or the background theory will say, well, you need that background on which the object can move. For the relational theory, if there's just one object in the world, then what am I talking about in the context of things? So maybe it's true that if you're the only person in the world, an only object in the world, without any parts, so that you can't distinguish various things, then maybe that, as I said, these are questions which you need to think about.
Maybe you want to just repeat the
Sorry,
question?
is there? Oh, I have to repeat the question. Okay, sorry. Yeah. What is it? Although intrinsic, isn't time an equal factor when it is spoken of, at least context, right? Yeah, as I said, the questions of time have a very deep parallel with the questions of space, including the fact that time can't be touched, time can't be destroyed, time has no parts in a particular sense. But time is a little more complex, at least different theories of time. But there is a very deep phenomenological existence of time. And one of the things by which time is different from space, and in fact, it's far more difficult to talk about time than about space. And one of the great challenges, what is called very famously as an aporia of time, is the fact that time is defined by instants, this particular instant. And the point about it, and this notion of the instant breaks all time into three parts: the future, the past, the present, and the future. But the instant itself is never present, because the moment the instant is, that now happens, it's already past. And the next instant is in the future. And that very simple structure of time leads to a very fundamental tension about understanding of time. In fact, as many philosophers have pointed out, much of the language of time is always spoken in the language of space. That it's very difficult to articulate a separate language for time which doesn't draw on the metaphors and images of space to talk about time. And as I said, that itself is a very different question and debate, but I wanted to focus on some aspect of space. But I hope at least this point which I spoke about for 1 hour, it's possible to ask questions and think about space without bringing in the question of time at that point. For the larger debates and discussions, you will have to do that. The next question is, if we pinch points, we don't move, every point becomes an object. If we move the time is needed. Yeah, again, this question about time, and the time becomes very central to the question of motion. But I must also tell you that if you really ask yourself, do I need time to make sense of motion at all? Physics begins by making two very important things. It's not just about moving from point A to point B, but it's about how fast it takes to move from point A to point B. And the question of time, which then becomes a question of velocity and acceleration, become ways of describing how fast it is to move. But suppose I just want to talk about just the movement, just displacement. Movement is about that. It's about a change. And can I do it without talking about time at all? I may not talk about how fast and how fast or how slow it is moving, but it's still moving. Now, for physics, the very important revolution in physics is about defining, as I said, the idea of instantaneous velocity. But the critique of Zeno or Nagarjuna are all part of this larger problem, not just about motion with just spatial displacement, but also another very important problem about that. That is, even if I move from 0 to 1 centimeter, and this is Zeno's paradox variation, then I first have to move to 0 to half centimeter, and then 0 to quarter centimeter. So I have to make infinite movements to make one simple movement. And we are finite beings, we cannot make infinite movements, and therefore motion is not possible, and so on. But the idea is actually captures something very important, and very, very deeply philosophical. Even today, one of the deep questions, according to me, which is the relationship between continuity, the experience of continuity, and the description of continuity, which is always through discreteness. That is, a line appears to me as a straight, continuous line. It does not appear to me as infinite points put next to each other. But any description of a line, even the mathematical description of a line, is by saying this point plus next point. You may put infinite points, but infinity itself becomes a story here of a very particular kind. And I really don't know how to talk about the reality of infinity here, but that description is always discrete. There is always space between 2 points. And the wonderful results like Cantor's theorem, etc., are working around this argument that between 2 points you will probably have infinite points, and that it's you cannot exhaust it by saying I'll go as close as I want. So these are stories we have all bought into. These are the stories we live in. We make sense of our life that way. Now the question is, philosophy is a way to make you reflect on that and maybe think we'll follow it and we'll still use our iPhone and this, whatever this computer is and all that. But, for 10 minutes or 24 hours, we'll think about this slightly differently. The next question was experiencing distance, motion, space. Yes, can the inferential, again, the question of time. And I think, time has obviously got very deeply into all of you. So, okay, let me put it, reverse it. Since time is so much deeply in us, let's reverse this slightly and ask you whether I can even think of motion and distance without the question of time. In fact, the question of time is not even about motion and in this sense, right? It begins with the earlier problem, the foundational problem for all philosophy, which is about change. And change is about something which has changed and something has not, which has remained the same. So the common example which I like is a leaf, which is green in color, which becomes brown. Something remains, the leaf remains leaf, but the green becomes brown, etc. So, can we understand more? Can I talk about this change without referring to time at all? At one level, in other words, what I'm saying is, can I keep talking about how the leaf has become brown from green and not invoke the concept of time at all? Or would we say time is an experience, that our change in our body is actually a reflection of biological time, that you actually feel, experience time? But I think, it's possible for us to talk about motion without invoking this question of time in the way we take for granted today. That's all, but I think, we definitely need a little more thought on that. But definitely, Nagarjuna's Madhyamika Karika, where he denies space, denies time, denies motion, etc., is a good thing to slightly read or attempt to make sense of. On last question, Cartesian graph, what is the 0 point from where x and y and z, right? What did Descartes imagine that 0 to be? Okay. Well, that's interesting question. What did he imagine? The real crucial point about the Descartesian thing is that there is no fixed 0 point. And that's the power of the Descartesian coordinate system, that every coordinate system with an origin can be shifted to another coordinate system with another origin. And that itself becomes a name, a value in another frame of reference. And there is really no absolute 0 point. So in a sense, you can understand this question by asking what Newton was trying to do. What Newton was trying to do is to figure out what the 0 point of the universe was. That is, what is the point in the universe which is absolutely stationary, which is not moving at all? And he found it, because through his formulation of the center of gravity, he took the center of gravity of whatever planets they accepted at that time. In his time, stars were fixed, they were not moving. And so they calculated and said, this is the center of gravity of the system, and that's absolutely stationary. Because, the center of gravity is an interesting idea, right? You take an object and you rotate it, let's say a circle-like thing or a ball, and let's say it's rotating very fast, every part of it is moving except the center of gravity. It revolves around it, for example, okay? You can actually, if it's a linear motion, center of gravity will move in a line, etc. But you can actually understand this idea that motion of something can still have parts of it which is stationary. And so this is the best example, as I said, is take a ball which is on an axis and rotate it, and those axis points just don't move, and everything else moves. At least this picture, right? So so the growth of physics, and definitely it influenced philosophy of space, is the breakdown of this absolute 0 point. There is no absolute 0 point. And if we buy into that story, then every 0 point is relative to other 0 points. Okay, then I will type out the Nagarjuna book. It's actually called Moola Madhyamika Karika. And there's a very good book, which is, I see some J. Garfield, etc. J. Garfield and Sampton have translated Tompa's commentary. I think it's Tompa commentary. I should know the name. It's there in the web. You guys can download it. It's a fantastic book to read. It's called, shucks, is there in my computer somewhere. Okay. Okay, what does quantification of space in Cartesian does to the, sorry, I have to enter. Okay. What does quantification of space in Cartesian do to the phenomenology of space? Yeah. Okay. So this is also a very deep question, because the real question here is this. On the one hand, space seems to be a quality. It's a quality which is felt, which has this emptiness, which has boundaries, all these kinds of things which we talk about space. Now, what does what does quantification do? Now, the Descartesian quantification, as I said, is like naming, right? It names points. It distinguishes points. It says, this is what you are, that's what you are, etc. It also does something more, because you can move from one point to another, how to move from one point, all that it tells you. Now, to reframe this question, we can ask, what does naming do to human existence? So in other words, I live my life and I can do what I want. Now, if my name was not Sundar and it was something else, would my life thing be different? And I think today we would say, of course, it would be different. There is definitely a question of naming, especially in today's, not only India, but the world. We know how sensitive names are and what they stand for, what they associate, etc. So in the Descartesian sense, definitely naming does something to our very idea of space. One of the important things, among other things, just as a quick thing to that, it does two very important things. One, it allows you control of space. It allows you control of space in ways in which you could not have imagined at all. You can actually read this very interestingly in very different ways. You can ask this question about whether GPS technology today and this mobile thing which tracks you everywhere, whenever you have it on, it is directly related to the possibility of naming points of space. In fact, that's what this mobile does. It tells me where I am, or where the mobile is every moment of its on existence, right? So definitely it makes a very deep implications about control and manipulation of space. And two, it also allows something else very important. It allows the possibility of not only measurement, but allows the possibility of modern science based on the idea that modern science can be measurable, which is the first idea from Galileo, where Galileo suggests that modern science begins by measurable concepts, describing through measurable concepts. So definitely, they have very deep implications in that. What does it do, therefore, finally, to the phenomenology of space? How does it change my way of being? And this, the only way you can do it is to ignore it. And that's what, for example, Henry Lefebvre and his Politics of Space, or Merleau-Ponty on Body and Space, can talk about the experiences of space, a body within space, or gender in space, without worrying about what Cartesian descriptions you have of that body or of that space. And that, of course, is not a great project for science, or not a great project for technology. Technology can't use Merleau-Ponty like it can use, modern science. But that's why people like you and me are there, hopefully, and all of you in this group are there, to make sure that we recapture that other notions of space which are very important. Okay, I don't see any more questions. Everybody has had enough of.
I have one more final question.
Yeah.
It has to do with this thing of senses. In the beginning, you started out with, there is a sight sense, smell sense, etc. But don't we have a space sense and it's just not named? You could therefore make sense of it that way. Yeah, you could say that perhaps it is there. I'm talking about the normal five senses. So the question was, I don't know if everybody heard it. She was asking, you could all hear it, is it? Oh, okay. So the five senses are the standard sensory,
sensory modes.
Model,
You
yeah.
could, yeah. In fact, I would say that like some people would say, mind is a sixth sense, if you like, because you see a lot about the world through the mind. Whatever the mind is, okay, mind itself is very vague here, but through the idea of the mind, you can access things about the world and know things about the world which your eyes can't see or perceptions can't do. For example, all of mathematics seems to have, or logic and mathematics seems to have come from reflections of the mind, not from looking at the world, not from the five sensory senses at all. And they tell you something about the world which none of your five senses showed you, and therefore people tend to believe. And that's why this privilege given to theory is based on this privilege given to mathematics and logic to some extent, that they are like the sixth eye or the mind's eye or the sixth sense or whatever. So definitely this question about the sense of the body, I think it's very much present. And one of the best examples where you get the sense of the body or the sense of space through the body. So let me put it this way. Now, the sense of the body, a sense of space, is very deeply related to the sense of the body. And the body is what is actually your lightning conductor for space. The way in which somebody like Merleau-Ponty would call is motility of the body, the way the body orients itself to the world, it orients itself to the things around you, to the people around you, are most wonderfully captured by the way dancers understand the question of the body and space. And I think theater actors and dancers and so on, and how you tend to sense things around you through your bodily senses. And the body sense is not one sense, it's not one of the five senses. It can be the unity of these five senses, it can be something more than that. But whenever we say something like this, people think we are imagining new senses and these are not biological and so on. But I think definitely a sense of location, balance, harmony, knowing where you are with the others are very much part of body experience. And you could call that sense of space.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Anecdote from space. Okay. Lovely. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Okay, thank you all. It was great fun. And it looks like it can still work in spite of my computer. Thank you.
Sundar,
Yeah.
are you also available to take questions over email and?
Yeah, sure. Please send email
Yeah?
and all that. Yeah. And
Okay.
I can also send some links for people if they want to read and stuff. And I think this is something which is long term, which a lot of things can be done. Anybody who's interested should really continue thinking about it.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, thanks all of you.
Thanks a lot. It was really
No
great.
problem. Lovely, thank you.
Thank you.
That is incredible. Somebody else, is it?